Welcome back to Reliable Sources, where every day we're trying to keep track of the drip, drip, drip of the Russia investigations. It was reported this week that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is asking the White House to provide documents related to Trump's actions as president, not just pre-campaign, pre-election day, but issues recently. That request includes, quote, 13 areas in which investigators are seeking information, including statements about former FBI Director James Comey made in the presence of Russian officials, also the firing of Michael Flynn, and a meeting at Trump Tower with Donald Trump Jr. As you recall, he sought to get damaging information about Hillary Clinton from Russian individuals. There's a lot to talk about here, a lot to unpack, including stories about Paul Manafort this week as well. So let's bring in Carl Bernstein. Carl's always the person I want to hear from when we're talking about these investigations. Of course, one half of the famed Woodward and Bernstein duo, now a CNN political analyst. Carl, let's get right to what this week's stories mean. What do all of these various threads add up to in your mind?
Two things. First, that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, is looking at the conduct of President Donald Trump, members of his family, especially Jared Kushner, also his closest campaign aides, in terms of their dealings with Russia, ethno-Russians, during the campaign and before, and in business. But there's a much larger context that now informs the whole investigation, and that is the conclusion of the American intelligence community under Donald Trump, not under Obama, that now is certain that the Russians were very, very effective in undermining the campaign of Hillary Clinton, in specifically helping Donald Trump. And we keep hearing the word collusion, which is not a legal term. What Mueller is focused on is something quite different than a simple idea of collusion. It's whether or not Donald Trump and those in his campaign and perhaps his family and business associates knew that the Russians were trying to help his campaign. And if they knew that, why didn't they blow the whistle on the Russians? Did they try to cover it up? Are they continuing to try and cover up that knowledge? That's the real question, not this word collusion, which Trump and the White House keep trying to focus on and saying, oh, no, we didn't collude. Did they know the Russians were trying to help Donald Trump? That's the big question, among others, including the possible obstruction of justice that the investigators are looking at.
And you're getting this from reading all these stories and piecing it together, or from sources directly involved?
Both. And let me tell you something about sources here that I think readers and viewers of these accounts that are so prevalent in the last few months need to understand. There are more than 21 lawyers involved in this case, representing people in the White House, around Donald Trump, around his campaign, around his family. And they have had dealings with Mueller. And it's very possible, from exhaustively talking to these lawyers and people in the White House and in the intelligence community, to get a much clearer picture, such as I've just given, of what Mueller is looking at. He has a sprawling investigation going into obstruction of justice, possibly by the president, involving the firing of Comey, into whether or not Trump, his family or aides, knew anything about the Russians trying to help their campaign. If so, did they try to cover that up? This gives a little more clarity. And to build on what Mark Warner just said, and I think Warner could tell us even more about this, the Russians were deadly effective in how they bought this time from Facebook and others. One example that I can give, and I believe Mr. Warner knows about it, certainly others on the Hill know about it, is that the Russians bought ads to keep front and center in Wisconsin and other states the issue of Black Lives Matter, understanding that if they kept going ahead and pushing this idea, this controversial notion of Black Lives Matter being crucial to the presidential election, it would turn out certain white voters in opposition to Hillary Clinton and in favor of Donald Trump. So that there's this sprawling canvas in front of us, and that is incidentally one reason why Trump is so assertive in his tweets,
Calling it a
this
hoax,
is
you
a
mean?
hoax,
Calling it a hoax?
that the Russians didn't calling the investigation
I think
a
he's
hoax.
inoculating his
It's anything but a
fans
hoax.
against all the stories that you and others are reporting. He's telling his fans, don't believe a word of it.
He's trying to make the conduct of the press the issue. He said that the enemy of the people is the press. Even more so, it would appear, than ISIS. He believes we're the enemy, which, of course, is absurd. Nixon and Watergate tried to make the conduct of the press the issue, but not to the extent that Donald Trump has. But the reason is these investigations are closing in on him, his family, and his aides. And if indeed there's nothing there and it's a hoax, then why has Donald Trump tried to undermine, demean, and obstruct, not necessarily in terms of a legal obstruction of justice, these investigations for 6 months at every turn? He's done everything he can, as have those around him, to keep these investigations from succeeding.
Carl Bernstein, thank you so much. We'll talk again soon. Before we go to break here, one note about attacks against press freedom, much more severe than the United States. This is in Turkey, an ongoing assault against journalists there. You really have to hear this from the Turkish president. He recently tried to convince the audience at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum that many of the estimated 150 journalists jailed in his country are actually terrorists.
Most of those you say are in prison aren't journalists. Most of them are terrorists. Most of them have had their names involved in many bombing incidents. Some of them have been involved in robbery. There are even some who've been caught robbing ATMs. Saying I'm a journalist doesn't make you a journalist. Most of them are like that. But unfortunately, when they say I'm a journalist, those on the outside count them as journalists.
Sickening words from Erdogan. His explanation is insulting, and we have to keep saying so over and over again.